Hey, what's up everybody? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I make my kick drums. So in this project, I've just got a kick and a bass. I took these both from a track that I'm currently working on, so they're not like 100% finished and polished sounds, but again, the purpose of this video is just to show the workflow that I use when making kick drums. So here's what they sound like together. Yeah, so nothing crazy going on. It's pretty standard sounding, right? Like 150 BPM Darkpsy. Our bass is in the key of B, so we'll remember that when we're making our kick again later. I'll briefly go over the chain that I'm using, and then we'll make a new sound from scratch. So I'm using Kick2 to make all of my kicks these days. I have been for about 3 years. By far my favorite plugin for making kick drums. It's just got everything you could ever want. Having said that, all I really use is the pitch and amp envelopes, as well as one of the click engines. It's basically a sampler, you know, just to add a bit more color and character to the kick. That's going into Black Box by Brainworks. This is, again, one of my favorite plugins. It's the first thing I put on basically every sound. It's an analog modeled tube saturator and distortion, and I find that it's just really, really nice for warming up sounds and adding a bit more grit without being super, you know, in your face and overwhelming. That's going into CQ by Sound Toys. Again, it's analog modeled EQ. Really simple. It's just low, mid, high. There's no spectrum analyzer or anything like that. It adds a bit of color just by dropping it on the chain, even without adjusting any of the knobs. And so again, it's just there to add a bit more like character to the sound. Doing some really small adjustments on the mids and the highs. I think a little bit of low end. Yeah, nothing much to say about that. That is going into Pro Q3. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with this EQ by now. This is great for, again, your more precise and surgical adjustments, making sure that everything is going to sit well in the mix. And then the final step is a limiter. I'm using FabFilter Pro L2, but you can use, again, like any limiter, any EQ is fine. This is here essentially just to push the kick into a ceiling, you know, to sort of round off the transient, give it a bit more punch. If I play the sound again, you can see that it's barely hitting half a dB of gain reduction. And this is also going to serve to catch any peaks, you know, later in the track if you're doing your arrangement and you get like some kick rolls or stutters going on. This is going to make sure that nothing is peaking over where you have it set in the mixer. So let's go ahead and make a new sound. I'm just going to borrow the same MIDI, and let's open up a new instance of Kick2. So I'm going to mute the bass for now. Yeah, so that's super loud. So the first thing we're going to do is -6 on the mixer, and then go ahead and -6-ish as well within Kick2. I'm going to go ahead and remove all these breakpoints, turn off the EQ and the distortion, mute the click, go into the amp envelope side of things, and sort of, yeah, just open things up a bit so that we can hear what we're doing on the pitch side of things. Cool. So the first thing I think about is the length of the kick, right? So this is going to be relative to your tempo, and the way I figure this out is if I go into the arrangement window in Ableton, if you highlight a selection in your arrangement view and then hover the cursor over an empty section of the grid, it'll tell you in this little window down here how long your highlighted selection is in milliseconds. So if I highlight just the kick, which is 1/16 note long, if we're doing kick, bass, 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 then hover, I can see that it's about 100 milliseconds long. So going back into Kick2, I'm going to give myself like, I guess 137. I like to give myself a little bit more than 1/16 note for two reasons. One is that we're going to be fading out the tail end of the kick anyways, so having a bit of extra length is fine. And two, I actually like to have a little bit of overlap between the tail of the kick and the first bass note. And that's because it gives you a bit more room to do things with like sidechain compression that sort of add a bit more push-pull to the kick and bass. And it also makes it easier to lock in the phases of the kick and bass when you're mixing them together. So the first thing I'm going to do as far as setting breakpoints on the pitch curve is set the endpoint to be the frequency of my bass, which is B, and then make another breakpoint at the same frequency. And this is so that at the tail end of the kick, when the kick and bass are overlapping, we have a steady, stable frequency in the kick so that it's a lot easier to make sure the phase is locked in for both sounds. And so let's start listening. All right, we got this big lasery sine sweep. So I set the starting point anywhere between like, I don't know, like 3.5 and 6K. Yeah, that sounds good for now. And then I set a breakpoint in the middle. And so this is going to kind of separate the transient and the attack of the kick from like the punch and the body of the kick. So usually I set this around like the second octave above the fundamental here. It doesn't have to be, but I found that with this kick, it was working quite well at this point. So kind of listening for where you want to set this breakpoint. Like further to the left, it's going to sound tighter, a bit more like housey. And then more to the right, it's a bit more open and like old school sounding. So like right about there. And then kind of adjusting the curves. Just playing with the curves by itself makes a big difference in the character of your kick. So definitely, you know, take some time and like listen to what you're doing with this. With the punch section of the kick, I actually tend to curve it upwards a bit, and this is because I know that because I want to accentuate this frequency range, like between like, you know, 123 and 62 hertz. You know, generally the punch of the kick lives around 100, let's say. So setting this curve like this makes sure that the sweep kind of lingers around those frequencies a little bit longer. Yeah, so that's sounding pretty good. And then I like to add in a little bit of a click using this like sampler essentially. So it's really overt and kind of in your face like this. So what I do is I find like a pitch that I like, and then just take the length super low, kind of adjust the filter a bit, and then mix it in nice and quiet. And the reason I mix it in like this is because I'm not really trying to have like a very obvious like sample sounding click. It's just there to give a bit more randomness and a bit more information in the ultra high frequencies. I find that it helps to make sure that the kick is like cutting through the mix over all your hi-hats and stuff, and it helps me hear the kick when I'm like beat matching and stuff if I'm DJing live. Yeah, so let's go into the amp section of things. So typically my amp envelopes look something like this. I have a bit of an attack and then a dip for the mid-range, and then another kind of peak towards the punch, the body of the kick, and then it fades out. So I like to have this attack because if I start with it all the way open, it's just got a really sharp artificial sounding click at the beginning, which I'm not a big fan of. And this is, you know, barely any attack at all. If I look in the top right corner here in Kick2, I can see how far into the kick I am in milliseconds based on where my cursor is. And so this attack is like barely a millisecond long. If I put it right here, yeah. So yeah, it's just kind of taming that ultra harsh high end at the beginning of the sound. This dip is essentially serving the same function that like a notch on an EQ would. We're targeting like the more nasal, like boxy sounding mid-range stuff between like, you know, like 800 and 400 hertz. Yeah, so if I find like, say, yeah, like 665 hertz right there, wherever it was, and then go back into the amp side of things, you can kind of set the breakpoint at the same spot. And then this peak is here to accentuate the punch in the bottom end of the kick. So again, if I go back onto this side, you can see like I'm at like 110 hertz here. Let's say half a second into it. Yeah, I find that exact same spot over here, and I can make sure that the sound is nice and loud at that point. Yeah, and then we're just fading it out because we don't want any kind of like nasty clicking at the end of the sound. Yeah, sounds good. So let's get into the plugins. So we'll go ahead and put Black Box on here. One thing I like to note when doing this is how loud it is on the mixer side of things. So I'm hitting like minus 12.8 right now. And as soon as I start making adjustments in here, it's going to make the sound louder. So I like to make sure that I'm compensating for these adjustments with the output knob. So yeah, just a little bit of each of the pentode and triode knobs and a little bit of saturation, maybe like anywhere between 15 and 20%. And then compensate for that with the output. I'm looking to hit like minus 12. I like my kicks to sit like right around minus 12 when it comes time to mix. Oops. Yeah, not a whole lot else to say. Again, this plugin is just, it's not supposed to be like an obvious effect. I find that adding like a little bit of color, a little bit of distortion, you know, just one plugin at a time tends to give me the cleanest result. Yeah, so in CQ, again, I'm just kind of going to roll off some high end. And then I'm going to make a big cut for the mid-range and like listen for which band sounds best. And then when I find the one that I like, I just back it off. A little bit of low end, a little bit of drive. Cool. And then going into FabFilter Pro Q3, I tend to add a high pass filter here, like right up around 30-ish, like 25, 30 hertz, just to get rid of all this excess information in the ultra low end. It's just gonna kind of eat up your headroom. You're not gonna hear it. You're not gonna miss it. Yeah, and about the cuts that I make, you know, because I know that the punch of the kick is living like right around here, I like to make a dip right above there just to kind of accentuate that this is where it's really happening, and this kind of makes it sound a bit cleaner, gets rid of a bit of the muddiness, and I do the same thing in the mid-range because I know that the synths are going to be occupying most of this frequency band. Trying to be like pretty conservative with the cuts, you know, I don't want to make huge adjustments yet. Listening with the bass to kind of just hear how it sounds in context. Yeah. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to set the fader to minus 12, which is where I want the kick to be sitting in the mix. And then I'm going to grab my limiter. And so with this limiter, I'm going to essentially push the sound so that it hits 0. And then, you know, once I see the gain reduction happening, I know that it's going to be sitting right where I have the fader set in the mixer. So I don't like to have tons of gain reduction. Again, this is just there so that the kick is hitting a ceiling, so that the transient gets pushed a little harder, and that the kick feels like controlled if I'm doing, you know, stutters or rolls or anything like that. Pro L2 gives you a lot of options as far as like the style. These aren't going to make a huge difference when you're not mixing a whole track and you're not, you know, reducing, you're not getting a lot of gain reduction based on your settings. Leave the attack pretty open, bring the release really short, because again, we're not trying to actually change the dynamic qualities of the kick. We're just putting a ceiling on it. Yeah, so that's generally how I start when it comes to making the kick. You know, when I'm actually doing this in a track, I'll leave the kick and the bass and MIDI for quite a while, so I can keep making little adjustments as the track is getting built, so that you know, I know that everything is contextual, right? I'm not just like finishing a sound before it's ready to be put in a track. It's like the kick and bass, especially, you know, you have room to play with them as the track progresses. So yeah, I hope that helps. I hope this gives you some ideas and inspiration for making your own kick drums. And yeah, thanks for watching.